New York City. September 9, 1935. Anthony Cugino aka Tony the Stinger, gunman, bandit, murderer, sits in his holding cell at NYPD headquarters following 15 grueling hours of questioning. Jail is nothing new to him. He spent all but the final year of prohibition behind bars. Called Philadelphia's public enemy number one, Cugino had been eluding police from New York, New Jersey and Pennsylvania for his part in a deadly payroll heist and the murders of numerous people. Now, after nearly 3 years of carnage, he's back in a cell knowing that he may be headed for the electric chair or at the very least will never see natural light again. Or spend time with his 20-year-old wife, Fran. Since one of the murders they believe he committed was that of a New York City detective, chances are, questions weren't the only things thrown at him. Probably some jabs, hooks and haymakers as well. Back in his cell, he ponders his bleak future. He looks down at his shoes. No laces. They took those along with his belt. Wouldn't want a criminal to cheat the system by taking the easy way out. It all started in the congested area of South Philadelphia, where Tony was born to Italian immigrants circa 1898. His father was a contractor and the family lived in the 3-story building that the father owned. One of 8 children, Tony was the only one to go astray. His father would say that Tony was a normal kid like the others until, when at the age of 12, he was wounded in the head by a hatchet wielded by another adolescent. His father stated that when he was released from the hospital, he wasn't the same. He also suffered another accident that left a scar on his lip. 12 was also the age that he was arrested for the first time and sent to the reformatory for a petty theft. By the late teens he was part of a bandit gang headed by John Mitchell. On October 22, 1919, Baltimore police raided a rooming house and arrested Cugino and a few other Confederates. Confiscated were a number of pistols and license plates. After a few days the men were released. 3 months later, at 10:40 a.m., March 9, 1920, a Cadillac containing Cugino and gang leader John Mitchell, William Little Willie Fergus, John Kirshner and 2 others, including a woman, pulled up across the street from the James R. Armiger Jewelry Store in Baltimore. Leaving one man at the wheel, the other 4 bandits crossed the street and approached the store. 2 drew guns and stood guard while Cugino pulled an axe from his coat and smashed the display window. As dozens of pedestrians gazed in awe, Cugino and an accomplice grabbed the display cases containing diamond rings valued at over $20,000 and calmly returned to the car. As the driver pulled away, a Good Samaritan jumped from his car and stood in the street trying to block the bandits from getting away. A shot from a .45 struck him in the foot and he fell to the side. The gang made a clean getaway. Acting on a hunch, Baltimore detectives took the mugshots from the men arrested the previous October and showed them to the witnesses. Cugino was picked out as one of the bandits. They contacted Philadelphia authorities and Cugino was arrested and returned to Baltimore. Next came Little Willie Fergus, then Kirshner. Gang leader John Mitchell was still on the loose and took part in a bank robbery that left a man dead. He was traced to New York City and arrested on June 30. Cugino and Kirshner were found guilty and sentenced to 15 years at the Maryland Penitentiary. Mitchell joined them there with a life sentence for the bank robbery and murder. Little Willie Fergus was found guilty of a bank robbery in Philadelphia, so served 5 years there before joining the rest of the gang in the Maryland pen. At first, Cugino was not a model prisoner, taking part in 2 riots in his first 6 months behind bars. Later he changed his tune and became a member of what was called the Sweezy Club, named after the warden Colonel Claude Sweezy. Members of the club were considered trusted inmates and granted special privileges. As the months passed, Cugino began having problems with his former gang leader. Supposedly, Mitchell accused him of squealing when he was arrested. At one point the 2 men got into a fight in the dining hall. Things came to a head on February 4, 1924. After dinner, Cugino climbed the stairs to the second-tier cell block, but instead of returning to his cell, he waited in the stairwell. A few minutes later, Mitchell came up the stairs and was jumped by his former gang mate. With a self-made knife, Cugino stabbed his former leader 9 times and slit his throat. Hearing the ruckus, a guard ran up the stairs and Mitchell fell into his arms. He and another guard carried the wounded prisoner to the hospital ward, but he was dead before they made it. Cugino readily admitted to killing his former gang leader. Mitchell always accused me of being a stool pigeon in the Armiger jewelry robbery, he told Warden Sweezy. Adding, whenever he met me in the penitentiary shops or in the dining room he would call me vile names. It got worse and worse and I realized it had to be him or me. Cugino also stated that he knew Mitchell had a knife too and struck first as a matter of self-defense. Since Cugino was a member of the Sweezy Club, he got the benefit of the doubt. Mitchell was a disturber at the penitentiary, the warden stated. He was a bad influence and always antagonized the other prisoners. Cugino was everything Mitchell was not. Cugino was liked by the other prisoners and never gave me a bit of trouble. Mitchell was not a member of the Sweezy Club. He spent most of his time in solitary confinement for fighting other prisoners and interfering with the duties of the guards. Cugino was a member of the Sweezy Club and a regular attendant at the meetings. It was determined that Cugino was acting in self-defense and he was exonerated of any wrongdoing. After a few denials, Cugino was granted a parole in 1932 and walked out of the state pen 2 days before Thanksgiving. One of the last bits of business that needed to be taken care of before he could be released was that he needed to have his picture taken. He refused. Most likely he knew he was returning to crime and didn't want an up-to-date photograph for witnesses to use against him as happened a dozen years prior. Forced to go before the camera, he did his best to distort his face. It appears that Cugino's first order of business after returning to Philadelphia was to get married. On January 14, 1933, a marriage certificate was issued to him and his 17-year-old bride Frances. As for crime, it has been stated that he went to work for the Lanzetti brothers, a crime family operating on Philadelphia's South Side. According to one story, in early February of 1933, Cugino declined an invitation from his former associate, Little Willie Fergus, who had been paroled late December 1932, to take part in a bank robbery. If true, it was lucky for him that he declined as Little Willie caught a fatal blast from a Tommy gun in a shootout after the robbery. The rest of the gang was jailed. The first crime we know that Cugino took part in was a payroll robbery in the summer of 1933. By this time he hooked up with a gunman named Salvatore Serpa, who supposedly worked for Al Capone before moving east. His other 2 accomplices were 2 Lanzetti gang small-timers. Edward DeLonzo aka Cowboy Wallace, a supposed cousin of the Lanzettis, and his pal John Zakorski, called Sox. With inside information from Serpa's brother-in-law who worked there, the gang chose to rob the payroll of a Philadelphia manufacturing company called Allied Kid. At 9:30 a.m. on July 14, 3 of the men entered the plant while 1 stayed with the car. Making their way upstairs to where the payroll was being doled out into envelopes, they entered the outer room. Charles Stockburger, the policeman on guard, stood up to stop them. One of the men drew a gun and placed it against the officer's chest and backed him into the room where the paymasters were. Once inside, the gunman pulled the trigger and Officer Stockburger dropped to the floor mortally wounded. The 2 employees jumped into a closet while the bandits scooped up nearly $7,000 and made a successful getaway. In the following months there was a rift within the gang. One version is that Cugino told Wallace and Zakorski to go to Chicago until things blew over, but missing their girlfriends, they moved back. Zakorski would later state that he and Wallace broke things off with Cugino and Serpa and it led them to believe that they might rat on them. Either way, that fall, Cugino and Serpa decided that their Confederates had to go. In mid-October, Cowboy and Sox moved into the Garden Hotel in Camden, New Jersey, right across the river from Philly. Posing as Zakorski's wife was his girlfriend Ethel Greentree. Wallace was with his girl, Florence Miller. On Halloween night, Zakorski was sitting on the porch when Cugino and Serpa approached him. They spoke amiably for a few minutes and the duo invited him and Wallace out for some beers. Unfortunately for the girlfriends, they saw the men leave together. Climbing into Ethel Greentree's sedan, the foursome took off. After driving a short distance, Zakorski was forced to pull over at gunpoint. On the outskirts of Belmar, New Jersey, he and Wallace were marched into the woods where Serpa and Cugino gunned them down. Back in the car, Cugino and Serpa knew that the girls would have to go too. They had seen them leave with their men. A call was placed to the Garden Hotel. Lured through some lie, the girls put on their coats and went outside. The hotel proprietress saw them walk a short distance before a car pulled up and they stepped inside. Back near Belmar, despite being shot numerous times, Sox Kozorski began to stir. Determining that his partner was dead, he staggered to the road and waved down a passing car, and was sped to the hospital. At first he refused to answer any questions, only asking that someone call the Garden Hotel and inform his wife that he was there. A call was placed and he was told that his wife and her friend had left a few hours before. Kozorski realized at once what had happened. He started to panic, pleading with the police to go out and find the girls. In exchange, he told detectives everything. He named Cugino and Serpa as the gunmen who killed Wallace and shot him, and came clean about the payroll robbery. Bulletins were put out to arrest Cugino and Serpa. Assuming that the girls were probably already goners, both New Jersey and Philadelphia police departments searched for them on the slight chance that they could find them before they were killed. Hopes were dashed the following day when Ethel's car was found in Downingtown, Pennsylvania, with a perforated and blood-stained back seat. Since there was an abundance of mud in the car, it was correctly assumed that the girls had been buried somewhere. It was almost a month later when a farmer stumbled on a shallow grave in his cornfield. Kicking the dirt aside, he discovered the women. The gunman spared no bullets. Miller was hit over a dozen times, including a fatal headshot. Ethel had 7 bullets in the abdomen. An autopsy concluded that she was still alive when buried. The heat was on to find both Cugino and Serpa, but the search was in vain. They were nowhere to be found. They may have headed to New York City. On April 21, 1934, 2 detectives were making the rounds along Broadway. At 75th Street they saw 2 suspicious-looking men. As they approached them, the duo drew guns and shot the detectives down. Detective James Garvey was killed outright, and his partner Detective Francis Gleason was severely wounded. Right or wrong, in time Cugino and Serpa would be named the probable killers. A few months later, the search for Serpa ended on July 25 in Chicago, when his lifeless body was tossed from a car with a single bullet through the right temple. Without proof of any kind, Cugino would get credit for the killing. With the murders of Cowboy Wallace, Ethel Greentree, Florence Miller, and now Serpa, Cugino became infamous for silencing his partners in an effort to insulate himself from anyone who might do him harm. This added to his Tony the Stinger, scorpion of the underworld mythology. If Cugino was in Chicago with Serpa, he quickly returned to New York City where, allegedly, he was dealing in counterfeit money with a Philadelphia gangster named Anthony Zangi, gangland moniker, Muskie. On August 7, Muskie and associate, Andrew Mickley met up with Cugino in New York's Little Italy. Supposedly, Muskie shorted him some money, and it wasn't the first time. Outside the restaurant, Cugino drew a gun and shot the Philly gangster numerous times, killing him. Mickley fled. Picked up later, he allegedly spilled the beans on why Muskie was shot. A few months later things heated up even more for Cugino when the FBI declared that they were joining the hunt for him. Although our cooperation has not been definitely asked by Philadelphia authorities, George Harvey, head of the Philadelphia office, stated, "We are taking the initiative because of Cugino's amazing and horrible record." Still nobody could locate the murderer. Months passed and various crimes and killings would be attributed to Cugino. Most notably those committed by the Legends Maze mob, more infamously known as the Tri-State Gang. A ruthless bunch of public enemies headed by 2 Philadelphia gunmen that operated mainly between Philadelphia, Maryland, and Virginia. Though there is no tangible evidence that Cugino even knew them, in some instances he would be called the mastermind behind the gang. Finally, after nearly 2 years of searching, police received an underworld tip. Cugino was in New York City and frequently used the subway stop at 47th Street and 7th Avenue. Working in conjunction with their NYPD counterparts, Philadelphia detectives who knew Cugino on site began to stake out the stop. After a few weeks their diligence paid off. Just before midnight on September 7, 1935, Cugino escorted a young woman down into the subway. He paid her fare and bid her goodbye. As he climbed the steps back to the street he was nabbed without a fight. Detectives learned that he had been living on Staten Island. The house was raided and his wife was arrested for harboring a criminal, and since a pistol was found, they threw on gun possession as well. During the first round of questioning the only murder Cugino admitted to was killing John Mitchell back in 1924, for which he had already been exonerated. He acknowledged his part in the Allied Kid payroll heist but denied killing Officer Stockburger, going so far as to say that he didn't accept his share from the job because it was blood money. He supposedly gave the killing of Stockburger as the reason that Cowboy Wallace and Sox Sikorsky were put on the spot. Claiming that he shot Sikorsky, a smart answer since he survived, which meant that Cugino couldn't be charged with murder. He denied all the other killings laid at his feet. Back in his cell, Cugino knows that even if he doesn't fry for any of the killings he's accused of, at the very least he will be in prison for the rest of his life. Flipping his cigarette package inside out, he scribbles a note to his spouse. "My dear Frances, please do not worry and try your best to be happy. I am going to end this life of living hell. I will see you in the next world. Your husband Jim. P.S. Forgive Sally." It's not known why he went by Jim, since he married her under his actual name. Sally was said to be the girl he escorted to the subway. After a guard checks on him, he removes his shirt and tie. Tearing the former into strips, he fastens a noose out of the garments. Climbing onto a sink, he ties one end of the noose around a water pipe running along the ceiling and the other around his neck. He jumps from the sink and robs society of the satisfaction of punishing him. Or did he? From the get-go there were those who thought that the scorpion of the underworld didn't sting himself but was stung by angry police who didn't like cop killers. What do you think? Did Cugino take the easy way out? Or was he helped by law enforcement? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video please like and consider subscribing.